Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Thursday, July 13th, 2023. So, tonight I'm going to be talking about transitioning from wilderness therapy, coming home. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that transition to another program. But again, for the listeners who might not have anything to do with Evoke's wilderness therapy program, part of what I'm going to talk about is the idea of transitions, the idea of parent work, and what we do in relationships. So it's going to be a broad topic, specifically in the context of those questions. With that in mind, I wanted to read this to you. I copied this, shared this in my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, and I thought it encapsulated so well the approach that I adhere to as a therapist, as a parent educator. It's from a book called Influence on Autonomy and Analysis by Stephen A. Mitchell. And this is what he says. I believe it's on page 1. He says, the emphasis is not on behaviors, but on rigorous thinking, not on constraints, but on self reflective emotional involvement, not on the application of general truths, but on imaginative participation. This suggests a very different sort of technique. The discipline is not in the procedures, but in the sensibility through which the therapist participates. And we're going to borrow from that idea about the therapist and the therapy and use it in parenting. And I'm going to read that sentence again. The discipline is not in the procedures. In other words, it's not in what you do, but in the sensibility through which the therapist or the parent participates. In other words, the way the parent thinks, the way the therapist thinks, the way that they see themselves in relationships. I just read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, talking about his facilitation of art and how he helps artists, musicians complete their work and come to their greatest work. And he talks about this idea of raising your vibration. And really, that's what this work is about. It's raising the vibration, moving from the conscious material to what's really driving things, which is the unconscious in our parenting and in our relationships. Stephen Mitchell goes on to say there's no generic solution or technique. There's a great deal of disciplined thought and continual complex choices. Since I first read this quote, I came across a couple of other quotes by some analysts, some therapists that I respect. From Dr. James Hollis, one of my favorite writers today in this field, he writes, life is not a disease, and a neurosis, not a cancer to be excised. I'll read that again. Life is not a disease, and a neurosis is not a cancer to be excised. Any seeming resolution today will have to be revised tomorrow, for the psyche is a flowing river, and yesterday's resolution is tomorrow's constraints. So at the outset of tonight's broadcast, what I'm saying is that there's no one thing that I can tell you to do. That it's a creative, self-reflective, deep participation. First with yourself, your own psyche, your own unconscious, your own history, and then subsequently that leads to the relationships that you have with other people. Carl Jung wrote it this way, or said it this way. He said, we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. And so that goes back to the my first experience in working with parents and parent education and children that are struggling with mental health. I got asked, and I get asked question after question that starts with the idea of what should I do? What should I do in this circumstance? What should I say? What's the behavior, the right behavior? And really what people are asking is, what's the thing that will guarantee the outcome that I want? And part of what people begin to understand in this work is that the outcome you want is the problem. The way you're thinking about it is the problem. Like Einstein said, you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem in the first place. You have to start thinking differently. You have to raise your right vibration. You have to start thinking about it in a different way. And so, what might sound foreign to new listeners or new watcher of this broadcast, I would just ask you and invite you to keep listening. If there's some glimmer of what I have to say, if you've been doing this for a little while, I think the glimmer is going to come pretty easily. It's gonna shine through pretty easily because I don't have pat answers. I don't have generic solutions. I don't give you answers that guarantee an outcome. and the way that you want it. And so right at the start, you're hearing something different. That the work that you do, the education that you're learning, that you're exposing yourself to doesn't guarantee any outcomes in terms of the other person, your spouse, your co-parent, your child. What it does do is it starts to change the way that you think and participate in relationships with other people. It starts to illuminate the long forgotten self inside of you. It starts to illuminate your background. And what I mean by that is you start to see more clearly and critically the things that you've been taught by your parents, by your initial early context, by culture, and by society. I was having a casual discussion with a colleague at a recent conference, and it was about a wide variety of topics. And at one point, he mentioned that he had a teacher, a professor, that shared with him the idea that it's not just nature versus nurture. And I was making the point that it's never just one thing, right? There's always some of the given, some of the nature, some of the genetics, some of the organicity, the facts that happen to us over which we have no control. And then there's something to do with nurture that contributes to the equation of human development. So as I was sharing that, he said he had a professor or a teacher that said, really, it's nature, nurture, and neighborhood. And I said very casually, neighborhood is part of nurture. When we talk about nurture, we're talking about parents, of course, and in the early fundamental years, we're talking about that primary parent, which tends to be, even in our culture, a mother, sometimes referred to as a functional mother, so as not to to isolate it to just one gender and one person in one role. So the functional mother, the caregiver, to the other parents, to the siblings in the family, to the extended family, to the messages that come through our media, eventually to our neighborhood, to our school, to our peers, to our teachers. Recently, I was talking with a client where I realized that we often don't talk about nannies and their impact. Nannies can have a profound impact on children. So we start to understand the context. That's why I refer to it as the context. And what Jung is telling you is there's nothing. It flows, right? There's no thing that you do or thing that you say or technique that you use that solves the equation, because it's a constant living relationship. And what does that require? You can't cram for the test. You can't memorize techniques. I've seen just as much harm in relationships, and specifically in parenting, when people have religiously adhered to the techniques, as I have when people know nothing about technique, nothing about tools and skills. So this, what I do here is I introduce you, or I expose you to a different way of thinking than likely you've been exposed to in the past. And to be clear, so as not to be full of myself, this is not my original idea. These are not my original ideas. I have curated the ideas. I've curated the information in these broadcasts, but they're not mine. I didn't invent this theory or this model. We start with the relationship to self. The relationship to self, the relationship that you have with yourself, is the primary relationship upon which all other relationships are oriented, are built upon. From the middle passage, James Hollis writes, the truth about intimate relationships is that they can never be any better than our relationship that we have with ourselves. I teach the exact same thing to the therapists that I train. You can't take people farther than you have gone. You can't encourage people uh, to embrace a certain level of authenticity unless you've done that same work yourself. Just as I tell parents, start with your work, I tell therapists, start with your work, right? It's true all the way up the hierarchy. It's really fundamental. This is why so often, and I encourage our admission folks to talk about this, when people are interested in doing a family intensive, it's one of the things we offer. I will encourage them to strongly consider doing an individual intensive. If you come to this with challenges with your co-parenting, with challenges in your spousal, your partner relationship, of course, challenges in your parenting relationship, I would strongly encourage you to consider doing your own work first because that's the foundation upon which all the other work is built. Couples therapy, even co-parenting therapy, family therapy is more advanced. It developmentally builds upon about the self knowledge that we have, the relationship that we have with ourselves. Now, I'm not going to avoid talking about tools and skills. I'll get to those in just a moment, but I want to share one more idea. I came across this thread yesterday, and I want to share it with you. Somebody wrote this and shared this, and it says, "Your work shouldn't be so immersed. You shouldn't be, excuse me, you shouldn't be so immersed in inner work that you forget to live your life. You shouldn't be so consumed with the identity of healing that you forget who you are. Inner work shouldn't just be another way you reinforce your sense of low self-worth. Inner work is a tool that enables you to live your best life, that allows you to overcome your traumas so you can actually enjoy being on this planet. Don't let the wellness industrial complex and predatory marketing get you caught in a never-ending loop, never-ending perfectionist inner work loop. You're worthy now." So I read this, and if you want to watch the rebroadcast of this, or at any time in any broadcast, if you want the slides that I have, you're welcome to ask for them. But as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, these very thoughts are the inner work. This is the inner work. Yes, work is hard. Yes, we have to unlearn so many things. Yes, it's painful and difficult and scary to step into our work. But the goal, to be clear, the goal in my broadcast, the goal in my parent education is not to change children, but to change parents. And that change will have a profound impact on the child. And the outcome of healthy parenting is not well-behaved children. The outcome of healthy parenting is peace, serenity, courage, groundedness, clarity, confidence. So if you hear somebody saying you're just a therapy junkie, you go to therapy too much, you have to live your life, that is what good therapy is like. I don't see my 1 hour a week on Fridays at 11 a.m. Mountain Time as a burden like I'm doing homework or filling out my taxes. Sometimes it's just a place to talk about movies or clients that I work with or a recent thought that I have. It's a mindfulness activity. I'm taking stock of my week at that moment. So the goal of this work, my goal for you, my hope for you is that you find peace, that you find serenity, that you find self-love, that you find self-care, that you find self-worthiness, that you learn to give yourself a break and to cut yourself some slack. Now, I know that I would be remiss if I didn't introduce some tools, but I'm going to introduce them in the same context in which I talked about them in the Audacity to Be You. I was asked several years ago, some of you know this story. I was asked several years ago to present to a group of parents. And the ask was, talk about the tools that you've seen families that have negotiated this process and identify as successful at some point. Talk about the tools that you've seen them use. I went and I came up with about 12, I believe is what the total was. And I shared it with my wife, who's my editor, my mirror, if you will, my muse. And I said to her, "What do you think about these?" She said, "People don't like lists that are longer than 8. So you're gonna have to somehow dwindle that down." So I kind of combined a couple. I prioritized the most important one, and I came up with my 8 tools for transforming relationships. I start off with I statements and reflective listening. And I'm sure many of you have studied that, maybe even memorized it, maybe even memorized our version of the I statement, the I feel statement. But again, it's not the tool, it's the principle in the tool. It's taking ownership for your feelings. We start with I feel in the I feel statement, not because the feeling comes first, because it doesn't. What comes first is the history and the belief system that comes from that history. What comes next is the event that triggers the feeling through the belief, through the thought process. And what comes third is the feeling. But we start with I feel. We start there to emphasize ownership. And I want to distinguish ownership is not choice. I'm not saying you choose to feel scared, you choose to feel angry. By no means am I saying that. These are not conscious processes. However, the feeling is yours. The analogy, the example that I've given to illustrate this in the past, if I go to pat on my friend Ted, let's just say, if I pat on my hand on Ted's shoulder in a gesture of friendliness and connection, and Ted jerks in fear because he'd been abused when he was younger, had been bullied when he was younger, been hit when he was younger. It's not accurate to say necessarily that I caused Ted to flinch, that I caused Ted to be afraid. It is Ted's feeling, and it comes from his history, and it's Ted's. It's Ted's to deal with. Now, if Ted shares with me that he doesn't want to be touched, and I do it anyway, then I start to take some ownership in it, right? Then it is partly mine, partly my responsibility. If I ignore that request or even forget about that request. But regardless, Ted has the feeling in him. He carries it with him wherever he goes. The issues that you have with your child were there before your child came. Yes, they triggered you in specific ways, real specific ways. Yes, the feelings are valid, but the fundamental issues were there long before you even had children. The child just exposes our issues. That's what I mean when I say the child is the teacher and not the student. That's what I mean when I say the child is the medicine that wakes us up. Reflective listening is about listening without judgment, is about really taking it in. There's a phrase that I borrowed from somebody that I shared in the chapter where I talk about reflective listening in the book, where I say, in order to understand somebody, you have to lose your mind. It's a play on words that really suggests that you have to get out of your own triggers. But the most difficult thing, mom and dad, husband and wife, friend, partner, whatever you are, the most difficult thing about deep listening, non-judgmental listening, non-reactive listening, is that you have to set aside your own feelings for a moment. You have to set aside your own reactions. You have to set aside or have some management over your own triggers. And the problem is, here's the secret. Setting those things aside momentarily will approximate or feel like not being heard. So if you have a history like most human beings do of not being heard adequately, to listen deeply, to listen reflectively will trigger trauma in you. And you'll justify your reaction the minute that you have it. So we have to do our work. We have to heal. We have to unravel. We have to unpack the narcissistic wound of having not been heard. That's what it is. Not being seen as a child in our history, in our lives, maybe even in our later lives. We have to heal that so as to be effective as a reflective listener. What I like about these skills, and I like them about all skills, is there's something to measure ourselves against. Sometimes what I will do with a client is I will write a letter for them. I'll listen to their feelings, I'll listen to what they want, and I will write a letter for them from a very objective place using the concepts, the skills, the tools that I have at my disposal. And I'll share that with them. And I'll say, look, the goal of me writing this and sharing this with you, and we agree on this before I do it, but the goal of writing this is not to get you to send it, not to get you to mimic what I've said, but to measure yourself against it. How would Gandhi react? How would Mother Teresa react? How would Yoda react? How would the Buddha react? How would the Dalai Lama react? How would a Buddhist monk react? How would the Christ react? How would God react? How would Moses react? Muhammad, pick your hero. And what I'm trying to illustrate again is a way of being, a sensibility. So those are the first two. The third one is ask or state the intention. I've started to see this in the mainstream media these days. When I wrote this, it's one of the I've said this. It's one of the most underused skills that could be helpful for us. If you are the initiator, if you're the one that's sharing, tell the other person ahead of time if you can, or at least at the tail end of your sharing. Tell them what you would like from them. I would like to be heard. I would like your feedback. I would like advice if you want to be crazy about it. Make it clear what you're asking for and ask them if they can do that. If I share something with you, can you just listen? If you're on the receiving end, ask the sharer, the initiator, the speaker, what they would like before you respond. Do you want me to just listen? Do you want me to share my thoughts? Share what's worked for me. I don't really like advice necessarily, but share what's worked for me in similar situations. And if you do that, if you state the intention, or if you're on the receiving end, if you ask the intention, I would submit that a very large percentage of the problematic discussions that you have will be reduced dramatically. Avoid imperatives. Should, ought to, good, bad, right, wrong, have to, need to. Replace those with I statements. See, we like imperatives. We like to say to people, this is wrong, this is bad, this is good, this is right, because we feel like it feels like we can't be attacked. We grew up in homes where the thing was to be right. But the shift here, folks, is that the goal is to be you. And that position is the strongest, most formidable position that you can take. Much stronger, much more solid than being right. Wars are fought, divorces occur, estrangement, conflict, violence, significant violence occurs under the umbrella of right and wrong. But if we can learn, like Plato suggested in the book The Laws, in his work, that in a utopian society there would just be one law, and the law would be to just be yourself. If you walk into Al-Anon, if you get into recovery, if you do the work, the attachment work that I encourage, you follow what I and folks like James Hollis and J.D. Gill and Carl Jung write, if you follow those kinds of folks, you'll learn that the goal is to become who you are. Honest, straightforward. So avoiding imperatives, replacing them with I statements. Avoiding polarizations. Phrases like you always, you never. Phrases that suggest all or nothing, either or, catastrophizing, generalizing, globalizing. You always do this, you never do that. This is the way it's going to be always. I saw a clip with Tom Hanks was being interviewed, and he said if he could just give one piece of advice to his younger self, what would it be? And his answer was, I would tell my younger self that this too shall pass. Or that famous quote that's a part of a poem by Rumi at the end of Jojo Rabbit, if you've seen it, where he says something along the line of embrace everything, beauty and terror. No feeling is final. And part of what adolescents experience, because their feelings are so big, is that the sadness, the depression, the anxiety, the fear, the hurt feels so big that it feels forever. It feels so big that it feels forever. And sometimes if we haven't evolved, it feels that way to us. I know that I struggle with that today. I know when my children are hurt or upset or in pain, that my first idea is that this is never going to go away. This is where we're at. You know, when we ask parents what skills and tools, the first one that they mention that they use after our program is avoiding polarizations. It's the most common one. Avoiding advice. I Advice is cheap. Advice is easy. Advice is also it's intrusive. And it gets in the way of the fundamental goal of therapy, of life as we understand it from attachment theory, which is to become who you are. If I give It's not a technique when I don't give you advice. I have clients that hear my broadcasts and will say, "I know you're not gonna give advice, but what would you do?" And I first say the question of what would you do is a very, very precarious question because you're asking a crazy person who has plenty of issues. What would they do? And sometimes I would do the exact worst thing in this situation. But I think what they're meaning to say is if you were operating with your highest, most authentic self, what would you do? But the fact of the matter is, I don't know what you should do because part of learning is making mistakes. One of the things that I wish I learned as a child more was that in order to be great at something, you have to be willing to be really bad at it. I hear parents say, when we teach them a lot of skills and tools, I hear so many parents say, I'm starting to get so anxious, I don't even know what to say anymore. I feel like I'm going to say the wrong thing. And my response today, different than it was years ago, my response today is good. That's a great start. Start with not knowing, start with being less sure of yourself, start with questioning everything. Avoiding advice is one of the tools. Compassion toward yourself, developing a practice of self compassion. Remember, the folks who teach compassion and peace and love, the thing that they do behind the scenes before they give that talk that they don't talk about in direct connection is they take care of themselves first. They meditate, they go to therapy, they participate in whatever is their practice. So it's not being Christ-like or Buddha-like, right? Or God-like. It's not being that's the trick. It's doing the thing behind the scenes before the issue, filling up your cup so you don't come to the relationship, the situation empty with your needs, with your needs in focus because you've taken care of them somewhere else. And you can't always do that. So you're going to have to do what number 8 says. You're going to have to take a time out because every human being is fallible. Every human being will find their limits. And so part of it is to learn to take a time out. When I taught men that were convicted of domestic violence, this was the first thing that we taught them was timeouts. But two things that I noticed in teaching these men, they were all men, at least in the courses that I taught. They were all men convicted of domestic violence. Two things happened. They didn't want to take a timeout because it signaled weakness. I don't want to own my need for a timeout. I want to make you the problem. I'm not feeling overwhelmed, husband or wife or partner. You're being a jerk. I'm not feeling overwhelmed, son or daughter or child. You're being unruly. You're being disrespectful. You see, we don't want to own. We don't have a relationship with ourself. We haven't learned to love ourselves. So we're faced with guilt and shame and fear. And so timeout is not just an easy thing to do. And most people want to give the other person a timeout. But my wife and I have talked about this many times over the years. And we've learned really clearly that when somebody thinks you need a timeout, they need a timeout. When you think somebody else needs a timeout, you need a timeout. Because what you're saying when you say to your partner or to your child that you need a timeout, you're saying you're about to say something that I'm not going to be able to handle or deal with. So who needs the timeout there? I mean, ideally you both would take it, but you need it. So those are the skills and the tools. Now, what I want to say about this is doing these things won't fix it. These are just behaviors. They can be evidence of a deeper learning, of a deeper knowledge, of that sensibility that Stephen Mitchell was talking about, of that vibration that Rick Rubin was talking about, of that way of thinking and being that I'm talking about. So when I teach these skills now, what I say is this, and this is from the Audacity of You, explaining how confronting the defense can serve to reinforce them or drive the underlying injury further underground, only to reappear somewhere else in some other form. I advise be with the other person so they feel safe enough to let down the wall. I don't confront somebody justifying. I don't confront somebody using polarizations when I'm trying to be helpful. When I'm in my place of capacity, I recognize that all of the things I just listed, all of the tools or the lack of those tools, are evidence of a feeling of threat, of a feeling of a lack of safety. So we don't confront these things. We try to be with people in a different way. Be with the other person in such a way that they will let down the wall. I don't confront justifying, but clients do it less and less with me over time. In this particular passage, I referred to the story where I put into a poster of these 8 tools that I just have gone over with you over the last 20 minutes. I pointed to the poster where the tools were listed, and I explained those don't make you enlightened. But if you were enlightened, you would use these tools. This is how you would talk and relate to others if you were enlightened. It's a way of being with another person that makes the difference in the relationship. So they're great, but they're not the end. They're a tool, not just a tool to help in relationship to another person, interpersonally, in other words, but they're a tool to give you a sense of where you're at with yourself. They're an intrapsychic tool. They change you. Like the father many years ago who said to me when stumbling and stuttering and stopping to write a letter, to begin a letter that he was trying to write to his son about a sensitive family issue that had come up while his son was with us. And he found himself violating one or more of these tools and these skills with the start of each sentence. And playfully exasperated, he said to me, I can't do this. And I said, you're letting it work in you. You're letting it work in you. So let's talk about what transitions look like, feel like, the concepts involved. I'll start off first with moving from wilderness to another program. I'll talk about more generally coming home after wilderness, and then I'll talk about transitions more broadly, of course. If your child is transitioning to another program after Evoke and you coming to pick them up, come ready to work. Don't come ready to celebrate. You're likely to be disappointed. Celebration will just naturally occur, but come ready knowing that it's going to be work. And if you're moving to a different program, the goal is point A to point B. If you're trying to make up for the difficulty of the intervention, the unpleasantness of the intervention by rewarding your child with a lot of fun time in between, it won't be fun. It's the hardest part of the treatment. Just get them from point A to point B. I've said before, and I experienced it myself as a father with all the education that I had, it is the most vulnerable time for families. Remember that good is good. I'm going to mention this a couple of times this evening. Good is good, meaning if it goes well, it's good. And if it goes badly, it's good because it's all assessment, it's all learning. We use the transition time, the transition experience for an assessment, but not just for the child. See, we're always focused on them, the other person, and their change or their lack of it. Look at your change. Look at how you're triggered. Look at whether or not you're able to maintain your composure. Look at whether or not you get upregulated, dysregulated. Look if you have reflexive responses versus flexibility in your responses. If it's simply knee jerk, or if you're able to keep your problem solving, your prefrontal cortex of your brain online. There's often a honeymoon. This is a significant intervention. These are significant interventions, and so the power of those interventions can lead to a honeymoon period where people are behaving well, right? Everybody's on their best behavior. Don't be surprised. In fact, you can expect to get letters from your child at the next setting initially that say this is the wrong program. I always say to parents, if this is the wrong program, then you can say to your child, well, then we'll find another one that will be the right program. Because they don't mean it's a wrong program. They mean, I don't want to be here. I can do this at home, is often the message in these letters. And what I say to parents, and I'll say this in front of children, is if they can handle a yes, in other words, if they're asking to come home and they can handle the responsibility that comes with that, with a yes, then they can handle a no. So clearly, a fundamental piece of the work in family systems is about learning to as parents set and follow through with boundaries, to find your boundaries first of all, which means essentially to find your authentic self. Boundaries are just an extension of that. To find your boundaries, to set your boundaries, to follow through. But on the child's part of the equation, it's to learn to respect the boundaries. It goes the other way around also, but that's fundamentally on the surface. That's the presenting issue. So if they can't handle a no to a request, then they're going to struggle with the answer no at home, with the boundaries at home. Sometimes they'll offer to you the idea that their peers are worse. It happens in Wilderness. In fact, so much of it is like their first week or two at Wilderness. At each stage of transition, there is a regressive energy. So you're going to see and hear some of the same kinds of things you heard and saw when your child first came to the program. The next step is going to be more like home. It's going to be more freedom, more exposure to triggers, to influences. Wilderness therapy, ironically, paradoxically, is easier than therapeutic programs in schools and home because the variables are under control, right? The therapist, the program itself exposes the child to a limited number of variables. So the program is going to be more like home and therefore challenging. I've said this, I'll refer to this analogy a couple of times. In Wilderness, your child learns how to juggle, using this analogy, 3 balls really well. When they leave and go on to the next setting, whether it's a program or home, they get handled 2 or 3 or 4 more balls, whatever the case might be. And see, if you've ever tried to juggle, I can juggle 3 balls well. I can't juggle 4. Handing me that extra ball, I don't just keep juggling the 3, I drop all of them. And if you were to toss into the rotation of my 3 juggling ball technique, 3 extra balls, I would drop all of them. I might end up with 1 in my hand. So the analogy is regression doesn't mean that there's been no progress. It just means that there's more stress put on the individual. More variables are present, more temptations, more exposure to triggers are present. And so there's a regression. I would encourage you, both at Evoke and in therapeutic programs, have the hard discussions with your child. Don't The goal of our program is not for everything to go well. Bring up the difficult topics through letters, phone calls, or visits. And if the therapist, the only time that I would make an exception to that is if your child was functioning in such a way that they were at a point of danger to themselves or others, then you can kind of use the glue of the program to kind of keep them together. Like I've said before, therapy is either glue or a solvent. So if your child is at a high level of risk, you can kind of ease things up. You can not go to the intensity. But aside from that very extreme case, bring up the hard stuff. Bring up the stuff that didn't work at home. Bring up examples, discussions. You're going to notice a different level of customer service at subsequent programs than you will at Evoke. And that's not just because we're great, although we're great, but it's because we're dealing with parents at the level of the highest point of crisis. So we have to have a really high level of customer service and communication, all the bells and whistles that go with the program. These broadcasts, the live broadcasts, the parent portal on the back end, the parent coordinator, the parent mentor. the weekly phone calls, the weekly support groups, on and on and on. The parent visits, all of that is there to support you. So the drop down in customer service and bells and whistles is part of the process. Remember that therapeutic boarding school or the second placement and wilderness itself is a time for you to get ready. I know that brings up a lot of shame for parents. Why should my child have to be in a program and wait for me to learn? And my answer is because they do, because that's the way it is. A parent's lack of maturity, a parent's lack of growth is always a burden on the child's shoulders, always. And what I would say to you to say to the child, the idea is you're doing it as fast as you can. You're working as quickly as you can. You're getting ready as much as swiftly and efficiently as you can. There's a change in pace. Wilderness therapy is it's dynamic, right? It's really, really fast paced. A lot happens in a short period of time. A lot happens during the week. It's intense. And therapeutic schools and programs are not as intense, and home even less so. You know, I remember I used to run marathons and triathlons. I ran a couple of Ironman triathlons in my time. And, the race day is great. The race day is wonderful. You're full of adrenaline. The sense of camaraderie is fantastic. If I could just go to the race day, I would still be running marathons and triathlons. But unfortunately, you have to train. And waking up on a February morning at 5:30 a.m. and going and running at the local high school track in the cold and sleeting rain, that's where the race is won or lost, or finished or not finished. So it's coming home is a celebration. A friend, a consultant, said to me many years ago when we started doing mid-program visits, we were the first wilderness therapy program to do mid-program visits anywhere because we wanted people to deal with their issues in real time. So, and somebody said to me, it's great that you do this, but that makes the transition, the graduation, it used to be called, that makes it so anticlimactic. When you've seen your child just 2 or 3 weeks before, it's not as magical of a celebration of a reunion. And at first I felt defensive because it felt critical of our process. But as I sat with the feedback and the idea for a moment, I thought she's right. It is anticlimactic. And so is being home every day. Yes, for many, many families, that first reunion can be really, really special and really wonderful. But that's not what life is like. Life is more like Tuesday morning at 5:30 a.m., going and running at the track at the high school by yourself in the dark, in the rain. That's more what life is like. It's not when you get the new job or the new promotion or the new raise. Those are all fun and wonderful. It's not your graduation from college. It's Tuesday afternoon. It's Thursday afternoon. That's the challenge of life. Ask tough questions of professionals at programs. And this is true of all of us. Ask tough questions and expect intelligent answers. And if you find yourself hesitating, which I have myself many, many, many times, it took me many years to understand this. And I still stumble with it at times. If you find yourself experiencing a lot of trepidation, a lot of fear about asking tough questions, worrying that the therapist is going to feel criticized or feel like you're not being cooperative, you are taking care of the therapist. And if therapists can't handle tough feedback, honest, tough feedback, honest, difficult questions, they are not up to the task. You are paying them, and that's all you really owe them. You get to show up and have your needs met in that relationship after the check has been sent, metaphorically speaking. And if you find yourself being hesitant, it's either coming from your background because most of us were not welcomed when we challenged the authority figures, the big people in our lives. They were able to spin it back and make it about us and our issues and our weaknesses and our problems. And really what they were doing was protecting their ego. And so it's either you either have that history like most of us do, Or you can sense in the therapist that their ego is not, that they're not secure, that they want to be taken care of. What I've learned about transitions is that the highs are not really that high and the lows are not really that low. It's not as bad as you think when it's low, and it's not as great as you think when it's high. The truth, the reality is somewhere in the middle. And like I said, it's good if it's good and it's bad if it's bad. Excuse me. I'll say that again. It's good if it's good and it's good if it's bad. That's what we come to realize. I think one of the things I thought about for many years, I haven't said some of this in so long, but for many years, what I used to spend my time trying to encourage parents to develop is this idea of valuing the setbacks and the struggles. I say things a little bit more poetically now than I did then. Then I would just say it's important for the child to struggle. It's important for them to relapse and regress, especially in a program, so that you can learn from it, because that's the way that life works. That's the way it works for all of us. None of us have a clear trajectory in our emotional growth and our maturity, right? None of us do. So let's not pretend that we do. So learning to see value in the struggle and the setbacks and see how that's a part of the greater picture of developing a self. We're always transitioning. I remember in middle school. I wasn't very good with my hands. That's why I do this work. But I took wood shop because everybody did, and I was told that it was going to be easy, and it wasn't as easy as I was sold. But I remember that the one thing that I made was a breadboard, because that's what you make when you're starting in wood shop, because it's easy to do. You glue a bunch of different color woods, different grains together. Then you cut it into a shape, and then you sand it and smooth it out, and then you put some sort of finish on it, oil typically. And I remember my professor, when he was teaching us about the breadboard assignment, he took a breadboard that had been made in a previous class, that he had made in a previous class, and he put it in a vise and he pushed on it until it broke. And if it broke at the seams, he taught us that that meant that we hadn't done a good job. If it broke somewhere in the middle of the wood, that means we had done a good job, because the seams, the in between, are the weakest part. The traveling to the next setting, the transition that happens, is the most vulnerable part for all of us. It's where we are stressed, where we are exposed. I often have heard children say that after a while, even though they want to go home and get back to normal life, it feels like when they're leaving us that they're leaving home, because they become comfortable. Things are predictable. Yes, they want to go home, and they don't mean in a literal sense that they want to stay, but there's some grief and sadness and fear and trepidation. That's all healthy. That's a sign of proper humility. It's overconfidence that is the greatest mistake that parents and children make in this process. It's valuing only the successes that parents and children make. Parents will ask me about their children. Are they being honest in what they're saying? And my thought was, I used to think when I was younger, I can kind of see the BS. I can kind of see when children are just playing the game. But after a while, I learned that some children were better than they could get by me. They just could. And then I learned as I went along even farther, and I saw children that had made what I knew to be remarkable, deep change, but still struggle with regression and relapse later. But that's true of all of us, right? We all can be very sincere and honest and still struggle. You know that old adage that when you know better, you'll do better? That's not really what it is. Everybody within the sound of my voice, everybody, even the person that originally said that quote, if they're honest with themselves, would know and would admit that there are things that we know to do that we don't do for ourselves and for others. Mentally healthy, spiritually healthy, psychologically healthy things. That's just a fact. The real equation is, if I feel better, I will do better. If I feel more at peace, if I feel more love, if I feel more fulfilled, if I feel more grace toward myself, then those are the things that will come out of me. So, like I said, transitioning to home after an intervention, expect challenges. You're going from juggling three balls, they're going from juggling three balls to juggling five or six or seven or eight, and you're going to drop them all. And that's a normal part of the process. It doesn't mean that all is lost. It just means that you're being presented with more challenges. We decided many years ago to shift the name. In fact, at the start of our program, transitioning from another program, we decided that we're going to change from the very get go the title of the end of our program, the name for the end of for that stage at the end of the program. We were going to change it from graduation to transition because this work is forever. Again, it's not laborious. I'm not focused on self criticism when I'm doing my therapy every week. I'm focused on self love. I'm focused on letting go of the things that hold me back. I don't arrive ever. There's always being around somebody who's arrived is miserable. Being around a parent who knows all the right answers is hell. Being around a partner who has all the right answers is hell. Being around someone with a beginner's mind, that's easy. Being around somebody who knows that they don't have it all figured out, that's wonderful. That's the goal, mom and dad. The goal is to develop a beginner's mind. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to make decisions and stand your ground, because you do. That just means that you don't do it self-righteously. You don't do it from a place of I'm right and I have the answers. You do it from a place of this is my best guess. This is myself. This is how I feel. This is what I want. And I know that might sound completely contrary to what you imagine healthy, strong, assertive parenting looks like, but I guarantee you that's what it looks like. And this isn't just me talking, it's everywhere. When the child comes home, the work begins. Wilderness therapy is like practice, like spring training in baseball. It's the practice before the recital. The recital, the real game, that's coming home. So it's important that you have an established pattern, mom and dad, of meetings that you're attending, of therapy that you're attending, that you're making use of. Remember, family therapy is more advanced, is more difficult, both for the practitioner and for the participants. That you have a practice of parent education, reading self-help books, listening to podcasts, not just mine, but others, working with a coach, a parent coach. And ideally, you don't just start that the day that the child graduates. You start it as soon as you get yourself together after you get the child here. You start finding what works for you in these areas. Just keep doing your work. I've said this to the therapists that work for me in all of our programming, our intensive programming and our wellness therapy program. I've said one of the outcomes, one of the measures of good therapy is that the client wants more of it. It's also a good business model, but it's more than that. It's somebody who wants to keep growing and keep learning. The more work I do, the more I realize I have to learn. My therapist used to say that to me, and it sounded like a platitude, a nice idea, but it's true. I'm less sure of myself and more confident at the same time today than I was 20 years ago. I'm less dogmatic today than I was 20 years ago, but I understand and can operate at a higher vibration than I could 20 years ago. Both things are true. There was a point in my life when I thought that therapy had an end to it, and for me, it doesn't. For me, it's just like going to the gym. It's just like having a healthy relationship with food or with your body, with exercise. Like I said, be prepared to work when you re-engage with your child. Be prepared to dig in. And you don't have to resolve every conversation, doesn't have to come to a resolution. But that doesn't mean that you don't jump into difficult conversations, but you could take a time out. You can't cram. You cannot cram this stuff. It may have worked in high school or college for you, but it doesn't work in mental health. Watch and listen to the communication webinars, the 8 tools. Use those as guideposts for you. Use those to measure yourself and your growth against those things. But being with the child, being home is real. It's not romantic. It's not celebration, although those things happen sometimes. It's real. And your reactions and your resolve, that's what's being tested. That's the important thing to be measured. I've said this before. I know parents have turned the corner when they call me or talk to me and say, here's what my child did, but that's not important. They say it as a matter of context, as a matter of background. But then they'll talk about how they reacted, how they feel. Now I know that they're focusing on the things that are within their control. Now I know that they're focusing on what they can do to make a change, to make a difference in their lives. Practice the 8 tools, but remember the 8 tools don't make you enlightened. But as you become more and more aware, as you become more and more enlightened, as you grow more and more, as you become more and more mature, as you become more of an adult, the 8 tools will just come out of you naturally. I've talked about this with students and clients. What are the mistakes that I see students and clients make versus parents? Students can weaponize the skills. I see that a lot. I see that them do that with each other. They become very dogmatic and rigid about the skills, and they forget the spirit of it. They use them to manipulate. They become more aware of how to manipulate, actually. When you get introduced to therapy, you become greater equipped, more equipped to be able to manipulate. Sometimes they just don't want to use the skills because they seem beneath them. They seem trivial and silly. I tell young people, use your therapist. Use your therapist for a reality check. Use your therapist as a mirror. Use your therapist to get clear. Use your therapy as a check and balance for yourself, to help you sort things out so that you can go back to your parents and have a better conversation. The biggest mistake that everybody makes is expecting the other person to change. So when it comes to the child, expecting the parent to change. We would like parents to change. I think parents have a responsibility as parents to grow up and to do their work, to mature. But so many parents think that they already are mature, think that they already are the paragon of what's wise and healthy and right. I tell children, I say sometimes, just assume that your parents never going to change. Then what are you going to do? Assume that you have no control over them. What are you going to do? I say the same things to you guys. Assume your child is never going to change. Now, what are you going to do? It's a wonderful, valuable thought exercise. Children believe that the context doesn't matter, that they can walk into their old context. They can walk into their old peer groups. They can walk into their old, as they say in AA, their old playground with their old playmates, and it won't affect them. They underestimate the influence and impact of contexts. They think in black and white ways. And like I said, they're overconfident. What I look for in a child who's struggling with regression is I'm looking for signs of surrender, of humility, of that idea that you often hear in 12-step meetings when someone says, I'm not quite sure what to do. My best thinking got me here. I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to ideas. Sometimes children will even say, I'll do what my parents want. I know they care. I know they're working, and I know they know more than I do. And my best thinking got me here. In terms of the parents, what do? Is that the most obvious and difficult things is that their child, they believe, they feel, they operate as if the child's feelings need to be solved. They want their child to get it because then they won't have to do boundary work. If my child will subscribe to the ideas, to the principles, to the values that I have, that I adhere to, then I won't have to do any of the work. It will just be easy. then I will have a cooperative child. The child is at a stage of developing an identity of who they are. That is a messy, inefficient, difficult process, not just for the child, but for everybody involved. So we want our child to get it. They don't even have the full brain power in many cases. And if they have a mental health disorder or an addiction, they may never have the full capacity that you have. Parents expect it to be easy. I think most parents would say out loud, this is not about fixing my child. I'm willing to do the work too. Most parents that I work with have some version of that in their language, in their thought process. But when it comes down to it, they still feel and hope that the child will get it, will figure it out, won't be the problem they were before. And I always say to parents and children, if things go much better than the picture that I'm painting, you'll be able to adjust. It's a lot easier to adjust to things going better than it is to things going worse than your expectations. Black and white thinking, the idea that we've arrived or that there is an arrival point, that's a mistake that I see parents make. That honesty trap, it's not about honesty. It's about doing the thing. There are times when I make a commitment to something in my life, a new practice, a new discipline, and at the moment that I make it, I'm honest about it. But that's not the test of the thing. The test of the thing is 5:30 in the morning on Tuesday. The test is when my parent is bugging me. I had a child say to me, "We talked about this. What went wrong?" And they said, "I didn't know my parents were going to bug me as much as they did." Focusing on what they can't control is the big trap for parents. So as the child comes home, have a practice of meetings, therapy, podcasts, books, parent education, and support. Remember, support is different than necessarily education. Support can just be a group of people that can hear you, that can empathize with you, that can emotionally give you warmth and connection. Suffering is inevitable, but if we're not alone in our suffering, we can more capably bear it. Take risks, right? The only way you're going to learn is if you take risks and fail. The same thing you would tell your child. Watching yourself. Are you co-participating in problematic behavior? How are your boundaries? I know for me, I'm still working on boundaries. That's not a euphemism. I'm not being playful with that or just telling you that so that you don't feel alone. I struggle with boundaries today. And it's not for lack of an education. I would suspect that I study parenting and psychology more than anybody listening to me. I suspect. Of course, there would be some exceptions. But for the past 30 years, I live and breathe it, and I still struggle with it. The fantasy that I can arrive and I can reach the end of my journey, that's the dangerous moment. Embrace the journey and walk slowly. A big piece of enlightenment, when I say that, is just coping with what is instead of trying to grab onto what should be. It's most easily illustrated when parents say, I want to get it back on track. This is the track. You're not off track. This lesson didn't come to you randomly. This is the lesson. Yes, it's true that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, but when the student has learned the lesson, the teacher disappears. That's just the way it works. And of course, the locus of control. Learning to know what you're in control of and what you're not, and focusing on what you're in control of. But it's so much easier to focus on what we're not in control of. It's so much easier to focus on the other side of the street, on your neighbor. It's so much easier to focus on what the child is or isn't doing, on their relapse, on their relapse prevention plan. It's so much easier to focus on them. Focus on you. Get enough support for yourself. If your child is struggling, the typical amount of support will not do. You need more. This task, even after wilderness, even after 2 years of treatment, it's going to require more capacity than you're probably going to imagine. You know, the greatest predictor of marital satisfaction is expectations. Same is true with children coming home. The greatest predictor of whether or not parents deem this whole process successful is in large part related to their expectations. If they imagine that the child will be fixed and give them no more grief, it's going to be tough and miserable. If they make the decision to take the child home because they're ready for the challenge, we've got a shot at this. Learn to hold on to all of this loosely. And what I mean by that is letting go of control, letting go of those things that you can't control. If I were to ask you how you're doing today and you were to answer, today's a good day. For today, we're doing okay. I'm doing okay. I know you're holding on to it loosely. But when parents say, "Oh, it's so great," he graduated from college. She's getting straight A's. She's been sober for 6 weeks. For today, for today, hold on to that success loosely. Don't bring your child home because they are done. Bring your child home because you're ready for them to come home. It involves, of course, some progress on their part, and it involves, in part, some healing on their part. But none of these programs, including Evoke, is going to turn your child into something other than a human being who's still on the path. The same is true for you. You're all off the hook from being perfect. The work is for you and for them to grow, to evolve. It has little to do with being happy. I'm borrowing that quote from Joseph Campbell talking about marriage, where he said marriage has nothing to do with being happy. It has to do with transformation. And transformation comes from suffering. You can't just dictate. You have to compromise. Same is true in parenting. This is a journey, proverbial journey, not a destination. The child is not fixed. Yes, we have a bias toward aftercare because it usually takes longer for families, not just children, but for families to reorient themselves. I had somebody who runs a wraparound program for parents. They do parent coaching and child mentoring. And they told me that there are 3 categories really they look at, where the child is motivated and the parent is motivated. Those are easy. That's not even an issue. Then they have those cases where the parent is motivated and the child isn't. They call those cases chasers. And they have a pretty good amount of success when the parent is motivated, even if the child's motivation is low. Then they have cases where neither one is motivated. Of course, they have very little success there. And there are virtually no cases where the child is motivated and the parent isn't. But they have just as much success virtually when the parent is motivated and the child isn't, as when the child and the parent are both motivated. I used to say to parents will ask me about, what are the outcomes of this work? What's the guarantee? And I would say, if you do your work, I can virtually guarantee you that this will be successful because you will have changed. All the movies you're watching, they're teaching this. All the artists that are creating art know this. It's a way of being in the world. Suffering and pain is inevitable. Detours are inevitable. Detours are so inevitable that we shouldn't call them detours. You're not off track. This is the track. This is the lesson. This is the life that you're living. I had a parent one time who wanted their child to understand the great big picture when it came to household chores. And I said, 9-year-olds aren't meant to get it. 9-year-olds are kind of meant to resist it, to make up excuses, to push against the boundaries. They're there to teach you how to be a self. And one of the most common characteristics that is a part of a child abuse is when parents have developmental expectations that exceed the child's capacity. I know I've done that to my children. I thought I have a lot of charisma, I've been told. I have a capacity to teach well, I've been told. And so I thought I could use those narcissistic gifts of mine, and I thought I could just whip up my children the way that I wanted them to. And of course, not true. My children have been perfectly designed by me to resist all of my talents. So I have to dig deeper. I have to learn some new lesson. What have I learned from behavioral contracts? I've learned that they don't work. I don't use them. I don't like them. I think they can be useful only if the parent uses it for clarity purposes. But to give a child a behavioral contract why they're in wilderness or why they're in a therapeutic program, to ask them to sign to agree to it would never hold up in any court in the United States ever, because they're signing it under duress. They're signing it in order to make progress and to be deemed ready to come home. Behavioral contracts don't do the work for you. And I think parents unconsciously, this is an important point, they unconsciously believe that it will just be settled. If it's written down and it's clear here and the child agrees to it, I will have no battle. And of course, you know, before I even say it, that you will battle. What the behavioral contract can do is give you the confidence that you've said it clearly, but you're still going to have to grapple with boundaries and with your child pushing them. And with the child inevitably saying, "I just signed that to get out of the program. I just signed it to show you that I could agree with you so that I could get home. I didn't really mean it." I don't know why. Well, I do know why people are doing behavioral contracts, because of what I just said. But anybody who's been doing this for a long period of time, we don't use them. We don't use them in the traditional sense. We might use them to help the parent get clear about their boundaries. Like I said, the goal in therapy is to keep going. If you're the same person today that you are in 10 years, I would argue you've wasted 10 years. If you're the same person today that you were 15 years ago, I would argue you've wasted 15 years. Start now. It's not, yes, it's work. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's going against your teaching and going against the grain initially. But inevitably, this leads to freedom, to greater peace and serenity, to greater confidence, to more hope. If you focus on things that you cannot control, you'll find yourself depressed and anxious. If you learn to focus on things within your control, you'll find yourself more hopeful. Simple as that. Take risks, learning, look at your own co-participation in the problems, grapple with guilt and shame. If you're not grappling with guilt and shame, in my experience, you're not growing. Guilt and shame are the sentinels that stop us from finding that next level, that next transformation, that next level of awareness. You will think when you get exposed to ideas, concepts, and tools that are healthier than the way you are now operating, you will think them crazy or wrong. You will think of boundaries as selfish. You will think of healthier boundaries as unhealthy. You have to relearn life. Like one of my favorite quotes from a guru who said, when we have children, it's not time to teach children about life. It's time to relearn life from the child. And as you heal and get some handle, as you unravel your own trauma and get some handle on it, you'll develop what psychologists call response flexibility, what Daniel Siegel calls response flexibility. You'll operate from a place of choice rather than just reflexive reactiveness. Remember that regression is normal. That's not used to excuse it, but it's something to expect and not be too terrified of. And when it occurs, I went home for a family event this last weekend. I experienced regression. I didn't act out too terribly, but I could feel it in my body. I felt young around my uncles and aunts and siblings and my brothers. It happens when we're under stress. It happens with new challenges. It happens in sports. You learn a new grip, you learn a new swing, you learn a new technique, and under stress, you regress to what feels comfortable. Regression happens at holidays. It happens at family gatherings. You've seen your spouse regress. You go back to their family, to a family event, and you watch your spouse get younger in front of your eyes. And if you're aware enough and not afraid of it, you watch yourself do the same thing. It can happen with holidays or specific contexts. The goal is to become a self, to become yourself. And to do that, we have to experiment. We have to make mistakes. There's a difference between a full-blown relapse, because a relapse means that there's no lesson learned. There's no awareness. The thoughts have taken over again. That's a full relapse. Some people call it a relapse that just involves kind of a superficial relapse, a flare up, like using drugs again can be a flare up. Relapse is you're back into the old thinking. You're back into the old patterns. It's important sometimes that we experience the futility. In AA, they talk about it in terms of going back out. Sometimes people need to go back out to figure out the futility of the old ways of coping and medicating. You'll have experiences with your child where you think, I thought we'd gone past this. It gets retried over and over again. Anyway, I could say more, but let me just take it to the take home slide because I'm well over my time here. Keep going. Just keep going. Keep listening. Keep reading. Keep going. Don't stop. I like the thought experiment of assume your child has been assigned by their therapist secretly to relapse and regress so that you can practice and test out your new coping skills, your set of skills that you've learned. Stop expecting other people to change and focus on whether or not you have changed. Work on your black and white thinking errors. As Tom Hanks says, this too shall pass. Have a great success, this too shall pass. Have a great failure, this too shall pass. Focus on your regression. Focus on your relapse prevention plan. If your child gets assigned a relapse prevention plan, ask the therapist, where's my relapse prevention plan? It's at least as critical and important. I would argue much more because you're the adult. You're the parent. Learn to live a day at a time. Learn to recognize your triggers and your behaviors. Find places to get support. Focus on the journey, not the destination. Come to this ready to work. I know in some respects I had a grandfather actually tell me many years ago when I was doing something like this. He said, you're kind of bursting my bubble. And other people in the group ran to his rescue and said, oh no, it's great. It's worth it. It's worth it. I said, no, I am bursting his bubble. It's important to burst your bubble. It's important to give you a dose of reality. Selling you that I have the answer that will fix your kid, that I have the formula, that if you follow, that I can guarantee that your kid will do what you want them to do what we want them to do. It's cruel. It's a lie. It's based on a lack of awareness and a lack of growth when people sell that stuff to you. Or just at the worst end of it, maybe just trying to make a buck off of you. Focus more on your work than on your child's work. That's a sign of being a mature adult. Your child's behaviors expose your immaturity and lack of growth. That's what they do. The real thing here is testing your resolve and your reactions. Everything that happens is grist for the mill. That's why when it's good, it's good. And when it's bad, it's good, because there's something there for you to learn. There's a lesson. Everything is an opportunity to evaluate all of your progress, especially the parents. Expect nobody else to change. It's going to be harder than you think. When you accept that, when you come to terms with that, it'll be all right. You'll be okay. All right, folks. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but I had a lot to talk about tonight. My two books, if you haven't read them, I strongly encourage you to read The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You. They're both available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, Finding You is that deep dive. It is that springboard. It is, in my opinion, the best offering that I know of for anybody to accelerate their work or to springboard into their work. August 16th through 20th and September 20th are the next two offerings. We also have an online offering. There may be a spot left. I'm not sure. It starts tomorrow afternoon, July 14th, and goes till Sunday afternoon. It's about a third of the cost and half the time, and you don't have to travel. And most of it's during the weekend, so you don't have to take off of work very much or at all. September 15th is the next online offering. We have a Returning to You that's available October 25th through 29th. I'm also running that. And then I'm going to be going back to the Finding You in UK as soon as I can. We have Custom Finding Connection for couples and parents. If you want to work on that, you can design a custom one for you. Talk to intensives@evoketherapy.com. Email us there, and you can talk to our admissions team there and talking about if that's right for you or finding family for your entire family. We offer support groups for families that are current and alumni. If you're a current or alumni family, the next support group offering is July 20th. We offer them once a week. July 20th is the next offering at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And once a month, we offer an alumni-only meeting for those that are a little bit farther along. July 25th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is our next offering. We also have an intensive support group once a month for our alumni. The next offering is August 8th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Visit evoketherapy.com/family involvement or email sarahd@evoketherapy.com. We have family treks. These are multi-day long treks in the wilderness. They can be a part of a child's wilderness program. They can be separate. They can be during or in the middle or at the end of your child's program. All kinds of configurations. Contact admissions@evoketherapy.com if you're interested in doing an outdoor adventure with your family. We have virtual coaches and therapists that provide coaching services all across the country, all across the world, for parents, couples, families, and individuals. This can be about boundaries, codependency, transitioning home, what I've been talking about tonight. It could be talking about anything in your life. These therapists and coaches have been trained in the attachment-based model. Contact coaching@evoketherapy.com to find out more. We ask all current parents to attend any combination, 6 of any combination of the following support groups: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to RefugeRecovery.org or NAMI.org to find free classes and resources in your local community. All of these broadcasts are available the next day on your podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or you can go to SoundCloud.com on your computer and listen there. You can also watch the rebroadcast of these with the slides and the video on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can find Evoke Therapy Programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram using the handles @Evoke Therapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find the Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. And on Facebook, we have a presence. You can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. You can also find our blog, which has wonderful content, as I've said. I'm most proud of the fact that when our staff offer a blog, they talk as much about their own growth and transformation as they do about tools to help you. It's wonderful that way. I'm so proud of that as a co-owner of this program, that it's as transformative for the staff as it is for the parents and the children that we serve. If you want to give back for people that can't afford treatment, the 3 charitable partners that we work with most are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can earmark your tax-deductible donation for a specific population of something that's near and dear to your heart, or for a specific program if you prefer. You can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com for questions, suggestions, copies of slides. And my next broadcast will be next week, July 18th at 6:30 p.m. I'll be taking live Q&A. You can send in questions in advance of that. You can always go to our website to find out when the upcoming broadcasts are and what I'll be talking about. All right, folks. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And in behalf of the people that you love and the people that you love, the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. It makes a difference. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.